Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are stepping away from soft mattresses, warm lighting, and quiet bedrooms and into a world where bedtime was not a reward, but another test of endurance. A world where nightfall did not signal rest, but responsibility. This is not a story of luxury or romance. It is the ordinary, often overlooked reality of women living in the 1700s, and the exhausting nightly routines that stood between them and a few precious hours of sleep. When we imagine life in the past, it is easy to picture candlelight glowing gently against stone walls, or neatly dressed figures retiring gracefully at the end of the day. But the truth is far less polished. For most women in the 1700s, bedtime was not about comfort or relaxation. It was about survival, preparation, and endurance. Every night, no matter how long or difficult the day had been, there was work to be done before sleep could even be considered. Modern evenings are often filled with quiet rituals meant to unwind the mind and body. A warm shower, comfortable clothing, soft beds designed for rest. In the 1700s, none of these comforts existed in the way we understand them today. The idea of self-care was foreign. Cleanliness, warmth, and safety were not guaranteed, and every task required time, effort, and physical strain. Women in the 1700s carried the weight of the household on their shoulders from dawn until night. Their days were filled with cooking, cleaning, caring for children, tending animals, mending clothing, and managing food and fire. By the time evening arrived, their bodies were already exhausted. But the night did not offer relief. Instead, it demanded a final round of labor, one that could not be skipped. The nightly routine was not optional. It was essential. If certain tasks were neglected, the consequences would be felt immediately, or worse, the next morning. A poorly banked fire meant waking up to freezing temperatures. Unsecured doors and windows meant vulnerability. Unchecked pests meant itching, illness, or infestation. Bedtime was not an escape from responsibility. It was the final checkpoint of the day. What makes this routine especially exhausting is that it was repeated every single night, regardless of weather, health, or emotional state. There were no shortcuts. No modern tools to speed things up. Everything was done by hand, often by candlelight, in cold, crowded spaces. Even something as simple as getting ready for bed required physical effort and patience. Sleep itself was not guaranteed to be restful. Beds were often shared, rooms were rarely private, and noise was constant. But before any woman could even lie down, she had to complete a sequence of tasks that ensured the household would survive the night. In this era, survival was a collective effort, and women were at its center. The concept of nighttime as a peaceful pause simply did not exist in the same way. Darkness brought danger. Fire hazards, intruders, illness, and cold were all real threats. The hours after sunset were filled with caution and ritual, shaped by generations of experience and fear. Every movement mattered. Every decision carried weight. This is why bedtime in the 1700s was not gentle. It was demanding. It asked tired bodies to keep going, tired minds to stay alert, and tired hands to complete one last set of chores. There was pride in doing it well, but also quiet resignation. This was life. This was normal. Women did not end their days by collapsing into comfort. They ended them by managing risk, by preparing for uncertainty, by doing everything in their power to ensure that the household would wake up safe, warm, and functional the next morning. Rest came only after responsibility. And perhaps the most striking part of this nightly routine is how invisible it often is in history. These moments were not recorded in letters or celebrated in paintings. They were too ordinary. Too expected. And yet, they shaped daily life just as much as any major historical event. To understand the true exhaustion of women in the 1700s, we must look beyond grand narratives and focus on the quiet hours before sleep. The moments when the body is begging for rest, but duty still calls. The moments when survival depends not on strength alone, but on persistence. Tonight, as we begin this journey into the past, remember this: bedtime was not the end of the day. It was the final challenge. And for women of the 1700s, completing it night after night was an act of resilience that history rarely pauses to acknowledge. In the next part of our story, we will step closer into the room itself, and begin with the first physical battle of the night, undressing from layers of clothing that were never designed for comfort, only necessity. For now, settle in, get comfortable, and let us continue. As night settled in and the final household tasks were completed, women in the 1700s faced another challenge that modern life rarely prepares us to imagine: the slow, complicated process of undressing. This was not a simple moment of relief or ease. Removing clothing at the end of the day required time, effort, and often assistance, especially after hours of physical labor. What we now consider a minor, almost automatic act was once a ritual shaped by social norms, limited technology, and the realities of survival. Clothing in the 1700s was not designed with convenience in mind. Every layer served a purpose, whether for warmth, modesty, social status, or physical support. Women typically wore multiple garments stacked carefully one over the other, each tied, pinned, laced, or fastened in ways that prioritized structure over comfort. By the time evening arrived, their bodies were wrapped in fabric that had been worn since early morning, absorbing sweat, smoke, dust, and the strain of the day. The outermost layers were often heavy skirts or gowns, sometimes reinforced with stiff materials to maintain shape. These garments did not simply slip off. They had to be lifted, unfastened, and folded or hung with care, even when exhaustion made every movement feel heavy. Clothing was valuable. Fabric was expensive. Damaging a garment through carelessness could mean weeks or months of additional labor to repair or replace it. Beneath these outer layers were petticoats, often worn in multiples. Each one added warmth and structure, but also weight. Removing them meant bending, lifting, and balancing, sometimes in tight spaces and poor lighting. Candles cast uneven shadows, making it easy to misjudge steps or snag fabric. Even a small mistake could lead to torn seams or broken fastenings. One of the most physically demanding garments to remove was the corset, or stays. These were not decorative accessories. They were rigid, tightly fitted structures designed to shape the body and support posture. Worn for most of the day, they restricted movement and breathing, forcing the body into a controlled position. Taking them off required loosening laces that had been pulled tight hours earlier, often with help. For women who lived alone or lacked assistance, removing stays could be frustrating and painful. Laces were usually tied at the back, making them difficult to reach. Many women developed techniques using door handles or furniture to loosen knots, but the process remained awkward. Hands tired from labor struggled with stiff cords, and fingers numbed by cold made precision difficult. The moment when stays were finally removed brought a mix of relief and vulnerability. The body, suddenly unsupported, had to readjust. Muscles that had been held in place all day relaxed, sometimes painfully. Breathing deepened. Shoulders slumped. Posture softened. This was one of the few moments when the physical toll of the day fully revealed itself. Stockings, usually held up by garters, came next. These were often tight and worn until they lost elasticity. Removing them required bending down, a task that could be uncomfortable after a long day of standing or lifting. For older women or those with injuries, even this simple movement could be difficult. Underneath everything was the shift, a basic linen garment worn closest to the skin. It absorbed sweat and protected the outer layers from dirt. While simpler than other garments, shifts were not always clean or soft. Washing linen was labor-intensive, and many women owned only a few. Nighttime shifts were often the same ones worn during the day, offering little sense of freshness or comfort. What made undressing especially exhausting was not just the number of layers, but the lack of privacy. Bedrooms were frequently shared. Children, relatives, or even unrelated household members might be present. Modesty was expected, even in cramped conditions. Women learned to undress discreetly, turning away or shielding themselves, adding mental strain to physical fatigue. Temperature was another constant factor. Removing layers meant exposure to cold air, especially in winter. Fires were often banked low at night to preserve fuel, leaving rooms chilly. Women had to balance the need to undress with the need to stay warm, often rushing through the process or keeping certain garments on longer than comfort allowed. This nightly ritual repeated itself every day, regardless of health or weather. Illness did not excuse a woman from undressing properly, nor did exhaustion shorten the process. The body might ache. Hands might tremble. But the layers still had to come off in the correct order, handled with care. Undressing was not merely about preparing for sleep. It was about preserving resources, maintaining order, and respecting social expectations. Clothing represented labor, time, and family investment. Treating it carelessly was unthinkable, even at the end of a long day. What stands out most is how little relief this moment offered. While modern undressing often signals comfort and rest, in the 1700s it was simply another task to complete. The body might finally feel lighter, but the mind remained alert, already preparing for the next steps of the night. This process reveals something deeper about daily life for women of that era. Their exhaustion was not caused by a single hardship, but by the accumulation of countless small demands. Each layer removed told a story of constraint, expectation, and endurance. By the time the last garment was folded or set aside, true rest was still not guaranteed. Undressing was only one stage in a longer sequence of nighttime responsibilities. Yet even in this moment we see resilience. Despite fatigue, despite discomfort, women carried out these routines with care and precision, night after night. As we continue forward, the story moves beyond clothing and into the spaces where sleep itself took place. The bed, the room, and the conditions surrounding rest would shape the night just as much as the long day that came before. When the final laces of the corset were loosened at night, the sensation was unlike anything modern clothing can replicate. This moment, quiet and rarely witnessed, marked one of the most intense physical transitions of the day. For women in the 1700s, removing the corset was not simply about comfort. It was about allowing the body to exist freely again after hours of controlled restraint. Yet even this release carried its own discomfort, vulnerability, and long-term consequences. Corsets, often referred to as stays during this period, were not fashion statements in the modern sense. They were structural garments, designed to mold the body into socially accepted shapes while providing rigid support to the torso. From early adolescence, many women were accustomed to wearing them daily. Over time, the body adapted, but never without cost. Breathing patterns changed. Posture was forced. Internal pressure became a constant companion. Throughout the day, the corset shaped how a woman moved, sat, and even worked. Tasks were performed within the limits of tight lacing. Deep breaths were restricted. Sudden movements were discouraged. The body learned to function within boundaries that were not natural but expected. By evening, muscles were tired not only from labor, but from holding themselves in unnatural positions for hours. The act of removing the corset was slow and deliberate. Laces that had been pulled tight in the morning had to be carefully loosened, inch by inch. This process required patience. Pulling too fast could snap cords or damage the garment, and replacements were not easy to come by. Fingers worked methodically, often numb from cold or strained from the day's work. As the tension eased, the body responded immediately. Shoulders dropped. The chest expanded. Breathing deepened in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. Many women described this moment as both relieving and unsettling. After hours of restriction, sudden freedom could feel overwhelming. The body, accustomed to external support, had to carry itself again. Muscles that had relied on the corset for posture often felt weak without it. The spine, no longer held upright by rigid fabric, sometimes slouched painfully. This dependence was not accidental. Years of daily wear gradually trained the body to rely on the garment, reducing natural muscle strength over time. The relief of removal was real, but so was the instability that followed. There was also an emotional layer to this moment. The corset represented public appearance, discipline, and social expectation. Removing it marked a shift from the public self to the private one. In shared living spaces, however, this transition was rarely complete. True privacy was uncommon, and even without the corset, women were still expected to maintain modesty and composure. Nighttime vulnerability increased once the corset was gone. Without its protective rigidity, the body felt softer, less guarded. In cold rooms, the loss of an insulating layer was immediately noticeable. Women often wrapped themselves in shawls or remained close to the fire while completing the rest of their nightly tasks. Health consequences tied to long-term corset use were subtle but persistent. Rib compression, shallow breathing, and digestive discomfort were common, though rarely discussed openly. These effects did not disappear at night. Removing the corset sometimes caused soreness as compressed areas adjusted. For some, deep breaths triggered aching sensations along the ribs and back. Despite these challenges, the corset was considered essential. Social norms demanded it. A woman without proper stays was seen as improper, regardless of her comfort. This made the nightly removal feel almost like a quiet rebellion, even though it was temporary and unseen. For pregnant women or those recovering from illness, corsets were sometimes loosened during the day, but rarely abandoned entirely. The body's needs were secondary to appearance and expectation. At night, however, there was at least a brief window where physical reality took precedence. This moment also highlights the difference between relief and rest. While removing the corset eased immediate discomfort, it did not erase the exhaustion accumulated throughout the day. Muscles were still sore. Joints still ached. The body was freer, but not refreshed. There was no guarantee that sleep would be comfortable. Beds were often hard, uneven, or shared. Yet the absence of the corset allowed the body to shift and settle in ways that were impossible during the day. Even limited rest felt deeper without the constant pressure around the torso. Over time, women learned to savor this brief release, even as they accepted its temporary nature. Morning would come quickly, bringing with it the ritual of lacing up once again. This cycle repeated daily, reinforcing a quiet endurance that defined much of women's physical experience in the 1700s. What makes this nightly moment significant is not just the physical sensation, but what it reveals about control and adaptation. The female body was shaped, restrained, and trained to meet external standards. Yet each night, even briefly, it reclaimed a small measure of autonomy. This balance between restriction and release shaped how women understood their own bodies. Discomfort became normal. Relief became fleeting. Strength was measured not by freedom, but by the ability to endure. As the night continued, the body, now free from rigid structure, faced the next challenges of darkness, cold, and limited comfort. Removing the corset was not the end of hardship, but a transition into a different kind of vulnerability. In the next stage of the nightly routine, the environment itself becomes the focus. The bedroom, far from being a sanctuary, presented its own set of challenges that shaped how women rested, slept, and recovered before facing another demanding day. Once the final layers of clothing were removed and the body was freed from rigid garments, the expectation might be that rest would finally come easily. But for women in the 1700s, the space where sleep took place offered little comfort and even less privacy. The bedroom, as we imagine it today, did not exist for most households. Instead of a quiet, personal retreat, sleeping spaces were often cold, crowded, and shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Most homes were built with practicality in mind. Thick stone or wooden walls offered some protection from the elements, but insulation was minimal. Windows were small, often poorly sealed, and drafts were common. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, especially in winter. Fires were usually banked low or allowed to die down to conserve fuel, leaving rooms chilled for hours. Women entered these rooms already tired, their bodies still adjusting from the release of tight clothing. The sudden exposure to cold air made muscles tense again. There was no steady indoor heating to rely on, only the lingering warmth of a fading fire or shared body heat. Sleep, when it came, was often interrupted by shivering or discomfort. Beds themselves were rarely soft. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, hay, feathers, or old fabric scraps, materials that shifted unevenly over time. These fillings flattened, clumped, and sometimes harbored insects. Regular replacement was labor-intensive and expensive, so many families endured uncomfortable bedding far beyond its usable life. Sheets and blankets were valuable items, carefully maintained and often limited in number. In poorer households, a single blanket might be shared among several people. Clean bedding was not guaranteed. Washing large linens required significant effort, access to water, and favorable weather. As a result, beds were functional rather than inviting. Crowding was perhaps the most defining feature of sleeping arrangements. Entire families often shared one room, and sometimes one bed. Children slept alongside parents, siblings shared narrow spaces, and extended family members or lodgers might be included. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Nighttime noises, movements, and breathing filled the room. For women, this lack of privacy meant constant awareness, even during rest. There was little opportunity to fully relax the body or mind. Mothers remained alert to the needs of children. Any movement risked disturbing others. Sleep became a light, fragmented experience rather than deep restoration. Animals were sometimes part of the sleeping space as well. Cats, dogs, and even livestock might be kept indoors for warmth or security. While practical, this added to noise, odors, and unpredictability. The line between living space and sleeping space was blurred. Darkness brought its own challenges. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. Once extinguished, rooms fell into complete darkness. Moving at night was risky. Women memorized the layout of their space, navigating by touch alone. A single misstep could result in injury or broken household items. The emotional weight of these spaces is easy to overlook. Sleeping in close quarters required patience and restraint. Conflicts had no place to dissipate. Personal grief, anxiety, or exhaustion had to be managed quietly. There was no room to withdraw or be alone with one's thoughts. Despite these hardships, routines developed to make the space as manageable as possible. Beds were arranged to maximize warmth. Family members positioned themselves strategically. Nightcaps and extra layers were used to trap heat. These small adaptations were acts of resilience, shaped by generations of experience. What stands out is how normalized these conditions were. Discomfort was expected. Cold was accepted. Crowding was not questioned. Women did not compare their sleeping spaces to an ideal, because no alternative existed. Rest was something to be achieved despite conditions, not because of them. Even in wealthier households, comfort was relative. Larger homes offered more rooms, but they were often just as cold. Heavy curtains and tapestries helped slightly, but heating remained limited. Servants often slept in even harsher conditions, sometimes on floors or in shared quarters. The bedroom, therefore, was not a refuge from the day's labor. It was another environment that demanded endurance. Sleep was precious, but never guaranteed to be peaceful. Women learned to rest where and how they could, adapting their bodies and expectations to the space available. This reality reshapes how we understand rest in the past. Sleep was not a given. It was negotiated nightly, shaped by architecture, resources, and family structure. For women, especially, it was another responsibility to manage. As the night deepened, new challenges emerged. Physical needs did not disappear after lying down. The necessity of navigating darkness for basic bodily functions added another layer of difficulty to an already demanding routine. And so, even after settling into bed, the night was far from over. Even after settling into bed, wrapped in whatever warmth the household could spare, the night rarely passed uninterrupted. The human body does not suspend its needs simply because darkness has fallen, and in the 1700s, responding to those needs after bedtime was one of the most uncomfortable and risky parts of the nightly routine. For women especially, navigating the night to meet basic bodily needs required caution, patience, and familiarity with darkness. Unlike modern homes, there were no hallways lit by soft bulbs or bathrooms just steps away. Most houses had no dedicated indoor sanitation spaces. Once candles were extinguished to preserve fuel and reduce fire risk, rooms were plunged into complete darkness. This was not a gentle dimness, but a thick, consuming blackness where even familiar shapes disappeared. Women often slept knowing that if they needed to rise during the night, they would have to do so carefully and quietly. Disturbing others in a shared room was discouraged, especially when children or working family members needed rest. The goal was to move without sound, without light, and without error. The primary solution for nighttime needs was the chamber pot. These were simple containers, usually made of ceramic, metal, or wood, kept close to the bed. While practical, they introduced their own challenges. Locating the chamber pot in the dark required memory and precision. A misjudged step or movement could lead to spills, broken containers, or unwanted noise. For women, the act of using a chamber pot was not quick or effortless. Clothing, even night garments, had to be managed carefully. Balance was essential, especially in low light. Floors were often uneven, and beds were not always stable. The risk of slipping or tipping was real, particularly for older women or those weakened by illness or pregnancy. Cold added another layer of discomfort. Rising from a warm bed into a cold room caused immediate shock to the body. Hands stiffened and bare feet met chilled floors. This abrupt change made the task feel even more burdensome, encouraging some women to delay rising as long as possible. Silence was crucial. Any sound carried easily at night. The creak of floorboards, the scrape of pottery, or a whispered exchange could wake an entire household. Women learned the quietest ways to move, often stepping in specific spots they knew would not creak. Odors were unavoidable. Chamber pots were emptied in the morning, meaning smells lingered overnight. To manage this, households sometimes used herbs, ashes, or lids to reduce discomfort. Still, the presence of waste within sleeping spaces was an accepted reality, not an exception. Privacy during these moments was minimal. Even when family members were asleep, the awareness of others nearby remained. Women became skilled at maintaining modesty in tight quarters, turning away or shielding themselves instinctively. These habits were ingrained from an early age. Fear also played a role. Darkness in the 1700s was associated with danger. Without light, any unexpected sound could trigger alarm. Intruders, animals, or structural hazards were all possible. Women remained alert, even half asleep, listening carefully as they moved. For mothers, nighttime awakenings often involved tending to children as well as themselves. Infants needed feeding or comfort. Older children might wake frightened or ill. Each interruption fragmented sleep further, making true rest rare. Returning to bed was not always immediate. Cold linens took time to warm again. The body, once awake, struggled to settle. Thoughts lingered. Muscles ached. Sleep came slowly, if at all. This cycle repeated night after night. There were no alternatives, no easier solutions. The body adapted, learning to function under these conditions. But adaptation did not mean comfort. It meant endurance. What stands out is how ordinary this experience was. No one considered it remarkable. It was simply part of life. The ability to manage these moments quietly and efficiently was seen as a mark of competence and maturity. For women, these nighttime tasks were an extension of their daytime responsibilities. Even in the hours meant for rest, they remained caretakers, problem solvers, and managers of the household environment. The modern concept of uninterrupted sleep was unknown to most people of this era. Rest came in fragments, shaped by necessity rather than preference. And yet, despite this, women continued to rise each morning and begin again. As the night progressed, another constant companion remained present: darkness itself, broken only by the occasional flicker of a candle. And with that light came another risk, one that turned even simple movement into a potential danger. In a world without electricity, the presence of light after sunset came at a cost. For women in the 1700s, candles were both essential and dangerous, offering the only reliable way to see in the darkness while posing a constant threat to life and home. Every evening and night, the use of candlelight demanded focus, restraint, and respect, because a single mistake could lead to irreversible consequences. Candles were not abundant or casually used. They were made from tallow or beeswax, materials that required time, resources, and skill to produce. As a result, light was rationed. Women learned to accomplish tasks quickly and efficiently before extinguishing candles to preserve them. Darkness was accepted as normal, while light was treated as a temporary tool. When a candle was lit, it demanded attention. Open flames flickered unpredictably, affected by drafts from doors, windows, or even movement within the room. Clothing, often loose and layered, could brush against the flame if one was not careful. Hair, covered by caps or scarves, still posed a risk. The danger was constant, quiet, and unforgiving. Many homes were built with wood, straw, and cloth, all highly flammable materials. Floors might be scattered with rushes or rugs. Walls were often hung with fabric or dried plants. In such environments, fire could spread rapidly. Once ignited, there were few effective ways to control it. Buckets of water, sand, or blankets were the only defenses. Women were expected to manage candlelight responsibly. This included trimming wicks, ensuring candles were placed securely, and never leaving flames unattended. Candle holders were simple and sometimes unstable. A small bump could send hot wax spilling or tip a flame onto nearby surfaces. Nighttime tasks requiring light were particularly stressful. Moving through the house with a candle meant navigating uneven floors and narrow spaces while holding an open flame close to the body. Every step had to be deliberate. A stumble could result in burns or worse. The act of extinguishing candles was just as important as lighting them. Before sleep, women carefully snuffed flames, ensuring embers were fully out. Leaving a candle burning overnight was unthinkable in most households. The fear of fire was deeply ingrained, reinforced by stories of entire villages lost to accidental flames. Even with caution, accidents happened. Burns were common, and scars were a visible reminder of everyday risk. These injuries were treated with basic remedies and endurance. Medical care was limited, and recovery was slow. Candlelight also shaped how women experienced nighttime. Shadows moved unpredictably across walls. Familiar objects appeared distorted. The mind, already tired, interpreted these shapes with heightened alertness. Fear was not dramatic, but practical. Awareness kept people safe. The process of banking the fire for the night added another layer of responsibility. Hearth fires provided warmth and were essential for cooking, but at night they had to be carefully managed. Coals were covered with ash to keep them alive without allowing sparks to escape. This task required experience and precision. Women often performed this duty, kneeling close to the hearth, feeling the heat on their skin while knowing that a single overlooked ember could ignite nearby materials. The balance between preserving warmth and preventing danger was delicate. This constant awareness affected rest. Even after lying down, many women remained alert to smells, sounds, or changes in temperature that might signal trouble. Sleep was light, easily broken by concern. Children were taught early to respect fire. They learned where not to step, what not to touch, and how to respond if something went wrong. These lessons were not abstract. They were rooted in real risk. What makes candlelight such a powerful symbol of this era is its dual nature. It represented safety from darkness, yet carried danger within it. Women lived in this balance every night, managing risk while completing essential tasks. The mental toll of this vigilance is easy to overlook. Constant caution becomes exhausting over time. The body might rest, but the mind remained watchful. True relaxation was rare. Despite this, households functioned. Nights passed without incident more often than not, thanks to careful routines passed down through generations. These practices were forms of knowledge, refined through experience rather than written instruction. For women, managing light and fire was another invisible responsibility. Success was measured by nothing happening at all. No praise followed a safe night, only relief. As the candle was finally extinguished and darkness settled in fully, the household entered its most vulnerable state. With light gone and bodies at rest, attention turned inward. The remaining routines of the night focused on personal care, comfort, and preparation for whatever the next day might bring. When darkness finally settled and the risks of fire were reduced, another quiet but unavoidable part of the nightly routine remained: personal hygiene. In the 1700s, this concept looked very different from what we understand today. Cleanliness was not ignored, but it was shaped by limited resources, physical exhaustion, and practical priorities. For women, nighttime hygiene was less about comfort or freshness and more about basic maintenance. Water was not readily available at the turn of a tap. It had to be drawn from wells, pumps, or nearby sources, often earlier in the day. By nightfall, whatever water remained indoors was carefully rationed. Heating it required fire and effort, so most nighttime washing was done with cold water, if any was used at all. Face washing was a simple, brisk process. A small basin, a cloth, and a few splashes of water were enough. Soap existed, but it was harsh, expensive, and used sparingly. Many women avoided daily soap use on the face because it could dry and irritate the skin. Instead, cloth and water did most of the work. Hands were sometimes washed again at night, especially after household chores. Linen cloths were reused frequently, rinsed rather than thoroughly cleaned. Freshness was relative. The goal was to remove visible dirt and maintain a sense of order, not to achieve complete cleanliness. Dental care was equally practical. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist. Women cleaned their teeth using small sticks, cloth, ash, salt, or herbal powders. This was done briefly and without ceremony. Tooth decay was common and largely accepted as part of life. Hair care at night required patience. Hair was rarely washed, sometimes only a few times a year. Instead, it was brushed thoroughly to remove debris and reduce tangling. This nightly brushing also served another purpose, checking for lice. Infestations were common, and regular inspection was essential. Once brushed, hair was braided or wrapped to keep it controlled during sleep. Loose hair was impractical and easily tangled. Night caps were worn to protect hair and provide warmth. These caps also helped keep insects away and absorbed oils. The body itself was rarely washed fully at night. Full bathing required significant effort and was usually reserved for special occasions or warmer months. Instead, women focused on areas that needed the most attention, balancing hygiene with available energy. Clothing worn close to the skin played a major role in cleanliness. Linen shifts absorbed sweat and dirt, acting as a barrier between the body and outer garments. These shifts were changed more often than other clothing, but still not daily for everyone. Washing them required boiling water and time, making frequent changes difficult. Night garments offered little luxury. They were functional, often reused, and sometimes uncomfortable. Softness was not guaranteed. Fabric quality depended on household resources, and even wealthier families valued durability over comfort. The mental aspect of hygiene is important to understand. Standards were different. Cleanliness was defined by visible effort, not perfection. Women judged themselves and others by practical measures, tidy appearance, manageable hair, and clean enough clothing. Despite limited means, these routines provided a sense of normalcy and control. Ending the day with familiar tasks helped mark the transition from work to rest. Even brief washing or brushing offered a moment of quiet reflection. Illness influenced these routines significantly. When sick, women adjusted hygiene practices to conserve strength. There was no expectation of maintaining full routines during weakness. Survival took priority. Mothers often extended these tasks to their children, brushing hair, wiping faces, and ensuring basic cleanliness before bed. These moments reinforced bonds, even in crowded spaces. What stands out is the absence of indulgence. There were no scented products, no mirrors filled with cosmetics, no rituals designed purely for pleasure. Every action served a purpose. Yet within these limits, women found small comforts. The feel of cool water on tired skin. The repetitive motion of brushing hair. The familiar smell of clean linen. These moments mattered. Personal care at night was not about self-expression. It was about readiness. Being prepared to face another demanding day with dignity and tact. This perspective challenges modern assumptions. Cleanliness was not neglected, but redefined. Women worked within constraints, maintaining health and order as best they could. As the final hygiene tasks were completed, the household moved closer to true rest. But even then, the night held one more layer of responsibility. Before sleep could fully claim them, women had to ensure the household itself was secure, quiet, and ready to withstand the darkness until morning. As the final personal routines faded into quiet familiarity, one last responsibility remained before true rest could begin: securing the household. In the 1700s, this task carried real weight. Nighttime was a period of vulnerability, and ensuring safety before sleep was not a symbolic gesture, but a necessary act shaped by experience, caution, and inherited knowledge. For women, this responsibility often fell squarely on their shoulders, especially in households where they managed the domestic sphere. Doors and windows were not standardized or reinforced in the way we expect today. Many were made of simple wood, secured with basic latches or wooden bars. Before sleep, these had to be checked carefully. A loose latch could swing open in the wind. A poorly set bar could slip free. Each point of entry represented a potential risk, not only from strangers, but from animals or harsh weather. Women moved through the home quietly, often with only faint light or memory to guide them. They knew which doors stuck in the damp, which windows rattled in strong winds, which hinges creaked if touched the wrong way. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in habit and repetition. Securing the household also meant organizing the space for the night. Tools were placed where they would not be tripped over in the dark. Buckets were moved away from walkways. Sharp objects were covered or stored. These adjustments reduced the risk of injury during nighttime movement, when visibility was nearly non-existent. Food storage required attention as well. Anything left uncovered could attract pests by morning. Women checked containers, covered bowls, and sometimes hung items from hooks to keep them out of reach. This was not only about preserving food, but about maintaining order and cleanliness in a space shared by many. Animals added complexity to nighttime security. Livestock might be kept nearby for warmth or protection, but they needed to be settled properly. Gates were closed. Tethers were checked. A restless animal could cause noise, damage, or panic during the night. The fire, even after being banked, demanded a final look. Women scanned the hearth for stray embers, feeling for unusual heat, listening for the faint sounds of shifting coals. This vigilance was instinctive, shaped by stories of homes lost to fire while families slept. In rural areas, securing the home also meant preparing for weather. Sudden storms could cause leaks or drafts. Cloths were placed near doors. Shutters were closed if necessary. These small acts reduced discomfort and damage, protecting both people and possessions. The emotional weight of this routine is easy to underestimate. Each check carried the unspoken question of responsibility. If something went wrong in the night, the failure would be personal. This sense of accountability kept women attentive even when exhaustion pressed heavily. Children watched these routines closely. They learned what mattered by observation. The order of tasks, the seriousness of certain actions, the calm focus required at the end of the day. This knowledge was passed down quietly, without formal instruction. Once the household was secured, silence took on a different quality. The noises of the day faded. The home settled. This transition marked the true boundary between work and rest, even if sleep itself remained uncertain. For women, this moment offered a subtle sense of completion. The day's responsibilities had been met. Whatever the night brought, they had done what they could. This acceptance was not passive. It was earned through effort. In larger households, coordination was required. Servants or family members each had assigned roles. Communication was brief and efficient. Everyone understood the importance of the routine. In smaller homes, women often worked alone, moving through familiar spaces with practiced ease. Their awareness extended beyond physical security to emotional readiness. They checked on children, adjusted blankets, ensured comfort as best they could. The act of securing the household also reflected broader realities of the time. Communities were close-knit, but not always safe. Trust existed alongside caution. Locking doors did not imply fear of neighbors, but respect for uncertainty. Once everything was in place, women returned to their sleeping spaces with a different posture. The mind began to release its grip, knowing the immediate environment was stable. This mental shift was as important as physical rest. Yet even then, vigilance never disappeared entirely. Sleep was light. Sounds were interpreted quickly. A creak could bring wakefulness in seconds. This alertness was a survival skill, refined over years. What stands out is how much responsibility was carried quietly, without recognition. Securing the household was not praised. It was expected. Success was measured by the absence of trouble. This nightly ritual reinforced a sense of control in a world full of unpredictability. While many things lay beyond influence, the immediate space could be prepared, organized, and protected. As women finally lay down, The house around them held the imprint of their care. Doors closed. Fires tamed. Spaces ordered. The night could now unfold. In the next stage of this journey, attention turns inward again, toward the emotional and mental state that accompanied sleep in the 1700s. Because even when the body rested, the mind carried the weight of the day, shaping dreams, worries, and the fragile peace of night. When the household was finally secured and bodies settled into place, sleep in the 1700s began under conditions that feel unfamiliar to modern minds. One of the most defining features of nighttime life was the absence of privacy. For many women, sleep was not a solitary experience. It was shared, negotiated, and shaped by the presence of others in close physical proximity. Beds were not personal sanctuaries. They were communal spaces where rest had to coexist with noise, movement, and constant awareness. Sharing a bed was common across social classes, though the reasons varied. In working households, it was often a matter of necessity. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth was precious. Sharing body heat was practical, especially during colder months. In wealthier homes, bed sharing could reflect family structure, caregiving roles, or custom rather than poverty alone. Women frequently slept beside children. Infants required nighttime feeding and comfort. Older children shared beds until they were old enough to sleep elsewhere, if space allowed. This arrangement meant that mothers rarely experienced uninterrupted rest. Even in sleep, attention remained outward, tuned to small movements or sounds. Married women shared beds with their husbands, but this did not guarantee comfort or closeness as we imagine it today. Sleep schedules often differed. Men might return late from work or rise before dawn. Beds were narrow, and movement disturbed rest easily. The physical closeness was practical, not romanticized. In extended households, beds might be shared with siblings, relatives, or even unrelated individuals such as apprentices or servants. Social norms governed these arrangements carefully, but privacy remained limited. Women learned to sleep with restraint, aware of boundaries even while resting. Noise was constant. Breathing, coughing, turning, whispered words, and the sounds of the house settling all filled the night. Floors creaked. Animals shifted. Wind rattled shutters. These sounds blended into a background that never fully faded. Silence, as we define it now, was rare. For women, this meant learning to rest in fragments. Sleep came in layers rather than long, uninterrupted stretches. The body adapted, slipping into lighter stages of rest, ready to wake if needed. This pattern shaped physical endurance but often left exhaustion lingering beneath the surface. Privacy was not only physical but emotional. There was little space to process thoughts alone. Worries about family, food, health, or the future had to be managed quietly, internally. Tears were often shed in silence or delayed until solitude could be found during the day. Even personal boundaries during sleep were carefully maintained. Movements were controlled. Turning over was done slowly to avoid disturbing others. Comfort was negotiated without words. This required constant awareness, even in rest. Nighttime routines reinforced these habits. Children were taught to lie still. Everyone understood that sleep was shared, and individual comfort was secondary to collective rest. These lessons shaped behavior from an early age. Dreams and half-waking thoughts blended with the presence of others. The warmth of a child beside a mother, the familiar breathing of a partner, or the slight shift of a sibling became part of the sensory landscape of sleep. These details anchored rest, even when comfort was limited. In some cases, shared beds offered reassurance. In a world full of uncertainty, knowing someone else was nearby provided a sense of safety. Darkness felt less threatening when not faced alone. This emotional comfort balanced the physical inconvenience. Yet this closeness also magnified tension. Disagreements had no distance to cool. Illness spread easily. Restlessness affected everyone. Women often bore the emotional labor of maintaining calm, soothing children, and easing discomfort. Sleep positions were practical rather than chosen. The strongest or most restless sleeper often claimed the most space. Others adapted. This hierarchy was rarely discussed but widely understood. Despite these challenges, routines formed. Bodies learned where to rest. Familiar rhythms developed. Shared sleep became normal, even if never ideal. What is striking is how resilience emerged from this arrangement. Women learned to function on less rest, to remain attentive despite fatigue, and to find moments of peace within constant proximity. This reality reframes how we think about rest in the past. Sleep was not about escape or isolation. It was embedded in relationships, responsibilities, and shared space. As the night deepened, the household entered a fragile equilibrium. Everyone rested together, alert yet still. And in this state, the final layer of nighttime experience took shape. The inner world of thoughts, worries, and quiet endurance that followed women into sleep and greeted them again at dawn. Even when bodies finally settled and the household grew quiet, true rest remained elusive. For women in the 1700s, sleep was rarely deep or uninterrupted. It existed in a fragile balance between rest and readiness, shaped not only by physical conditions but by the constant presence of thought, concern, and responsibility. The night was not a blank space between days. It was a continuation of awareness, where the mind carried what the body could no longer act upon. Sleep came lightly. The body, trained by years of shared spaces and unpredictable nights, learned to remain alert even while resting. Women drifted in and out of shallow sleep, easily pulled back to wakefulness by small sounds or changes in the air. A shift in breathing nearby, a sudden quiet where noise was expected, or the distant sound of wind against the house could all trigger awareness. This light sleep was not a flaw. It was an adaptation. In a world without alarms, locks, or emergency systems, sensitivity was protection. Women learned to listen even while resting. The mind stayed partially engaged, scanning for anything out of place. Alongside this vigilance lived worry. The night gave space for thoughts that daylight tasks kept at bay. Concerns about food, stores, illness, children, weather, and the future surfaced in the quiet. These were not dramatic anxieties, but steady, practical questions with no immediate answers. Would there be enough food until the next harvest? Would a child's cough worsen by morning? Would rain damage stored grain? Would tomorrow bring more work than the body could bear? These thoughts did not arrive all at once. They came in fragments, drifting through half-sleep. For women, these worries were closely tied to responsibility. They were not abstract fears, but reflections of daily management. The mind rehearsed problems, searching for solutions that could be applied at dawn. In this way, the night became a planning space, even without conscious intention. Emotional strain also found its way into the dark. Grief had fewer distractions at night. Losses that could be set aside during work returned quietly. Memories surfaced, without warning. Tears were shed silently to avoid waking others. There was little space for release, but the night allowed moments of internal acknowledgement. Pregnancy and illness heightened this mental weight. Expectant mothers felt the physical presence of change alongside uncertainty. Women caring for the sick listened constantly, half awake, ready to respond. Sleep became a series of pauses rather than a full retreat. Dreams reflected this reality. They blended daily tasks with imagined outcomes, often indistinguishable from waking thought. The boundary between rest and awareness was thin. Waking from a dream did not feel like crossing a line, but like continuing a process already in motion. Despite this, women found ways to settle the mind. Familiar routines before bed offered structure. Repetition created a sense of order that carried into sleep. Knowing that everything had been done as well as possible allowed some measure of calm. Faith and belief played a role for many. Night prayers or quiet reflection offered comfort, placing worries into a larger framework. This did not erase fear, but it softened its edges. The physical posture of sleep also mattered. Women often slept on their sides or partially upright, positions that felt safer and allowed quicker response. Full relaxation was rare. Readiness was built into the body. Morning approached quietly. There was no clear boundary between night and day in the mind. The first sounds of waking blended with lingering thoughts. Sleep ended not with refreshment, but with acceptance. This pattern repeated daily. Over time, it shaped endurance rather than restfulness. Women learned to function within fatigue, to carry on despite incomplete recovery. What stands out is not weakness, but strength adapted to circumstance. Light sleep was a skill. Worry was a form of care. Vigilance was protection. The night did not erase the day's burdens, but it transformed them. In the quiet hours, women processed what could not be addressed immediately, preparing themselves mentally for what lay ahead. As dawn approached, the mind slowly shifted again. Thoughts turned toward tasks waiting to be done. The body, though tired, responded. Another day began. In the final stage of this journey, we step back and look at the full cycle. The nightly routines, the physical demands, the mental weight, and the quiet resilience that defined women's lives in the 1700s come together, revealing a form of strength rarely recorded, but deeply lived. As the long night slowly loosened its grip, morning arrived without ceremony. There were no alarms, no gentle transitions designed to ease the body from rest into activity. For women in the 1700s, waking often happened before rest was complete. The body rose not because it was ready, but because the day demanded it. This final stage of the nightly cycle reveals perhaps the clearest truth about their lives. Rest was always partial, and endurance was essential. Dawn did not always bring light immediately. In many seasons, women woke in dim conditions, guided more by habit than by the sun. The body learned to sense time through routine, through the subtle sounds of animals stirring, changes in temperature, or the rhythm of shared living spaces. Sleep ended quietly, often without a clear dividing line. There was no lingering in bed. Remaining under blankets after waking was rarely practical. Fires needed attention. Food preparation had to begin. Children stirred and required care. The body, still heavy with fatigue, responded out of necessity. Muscles protested, joints ached, and eyes burned with lingering tiredness. What makes this moment significant is not just the lack of rest, but the acceptance of it. Waking tired was normal. It was expected. Women did not measure their readiness by how refreshed they felt, but by what needed to be done. The body adjusted to this rhythm over years, learning to function with an incomplete recovery. The transition from night to day was immediate. Thoughts that had drifted through light sleep now turned into action. Plans formed overnight were tested against reality. Concerns became tasks. The mental work of the night flowed directly into the physical labor of morning. Clothing was put back on, often cold and stiff from the night air. Layers returned, one by one. The corset or stays would soon be laced again, signaling the return to structure and restraint. This act alone marked the end of whatever freedom the body had briefly known. Morning routines were efficient. There was little room for hesitation. Water was fetched. Fires were revived. The household shifted from stillness to movement quickly. Women moved through familiar motions, guided by muscle memory rather than energy. Children sensed this change and responded. Mothers moved seamlessly from their own fatigue into caregiving roles. Comfort, instruction, and direction were given even when patience was thin. Emotional labor resumed alongside physical work. The memory of the night did not fade immediately. Poor sleep lingered in the body, shaping mood and pace. Yet there was no language for burnout or exhaustion as we describe it now. Fatigue was part of life, not a condition to be solved. In many ways, this constant tiredness shaped character. Women developed resilience that did not rely on rest, but on consistency. They learned how to pace themselves, how to conserve energy in small ways, how to endure long stretches without relief. This endurance was not dramatic. It was quiet and repetitive. It appeared in the ability to keep moving, to manage households, to care for others while personal needs remained secondary. It was not celebrated, but it was essential. The cycle repeated endlessly. Day led to night. Night led back to day. There were no breaks in the rhythm unless illness or extreme circumstance intervened. Even then, responsibilities were often redistributed rather than removed. What is striking is how invisible this struggle remains in historical narratives. Major events are recorded. Daily endurance is not. Yet, this quiet repetition formed the backbone of society. Without it, nothing else functioned. Women carried this rhythm across years, through pregnancies, losses, changing seasons, and aging bodies. The night offered limited rest, but it also offered continuity. The routines provided structure in an unpredictable world. Waking before rest was complete did not mean women were unaware of their exhaustion. They felt it deeply. But awareness did not change necessity. The measure of strength was not how rested one felt, but how reliably one continued. This perspective challenges modern ideas about productivity and rest. It reminds us that endurance has many forms, and that comfort is not a universal measure of worth or capability. As the morning fully arrived, the night's routines faded into memory, replaced by the demands of the day. Yet their effects remained, shaping posture, mood, and movement. Understanding this final stage completes the picture. Night was not a pause, but a transition. Rest was partial, vigilance constant, and responsibility unbroken. In the last part of this journey, we step back to reflect on the full cycle of night as lived by women in the 1700s, and what it reveals about resilience, adaptation, and the quiet strength that history so often overlooks. When we step back and look at the full arc of the night as lived by women in the 1700s, a different understanding of strength begins to emerge. Not the kind recorded in battles or written into official histories, but a quieter, more persistent resilience shaped by repetition, responsibility, and adaptation. The night was not merely a backdrop to their lives. It was an active space where endurance was practiced, refined, and carried forward into the next day. Every part of the night demanded something. The body was asked to keep moving when it wanted to rest. The mind was asked to remain alert when it longed to let go. The spirit was asked to endure without recognition. And, yet, night after night, women met these demands, not because they were exceptional by the standards of their time, but because survival required nothing less. This resilience did not appear suddenly. It was built slowly, beginning in childhood. Girls learned routines by watching. They absorbed the rhythms of evening tasks, the seriousness of securing the home, the careful movements in darkness. By the time they reached adulthood, these behaviors were instinctive. What might seem overwhelming to us was, to them, simply how life worked. The strength of this resilience lay in its subtlety. It was not loud or forceful. It did not announce itself. It appeared in consistency. In the ability to repeat the same demanding routines regardless of mood, weather, or fatigue. In the capacity to carry worry quietly, without letting it disrupt the functioning of the household. Nighttime magnified this quality because it stripped away distractions. There was no audience, no external reward. The work of the night existed almost entirely in private, witnessed only by those who shared the space. Its success was defined by absence, no fire, no intrusion, no illness worsening, no crisis before dawn. This kind of success rarely leaves records. It does not create dramatic moments for historians to capture. Yet it forms the foundation upon which everything else rests. Without safe nights, days could not begin. Without endurance through darkness, progress in daylight would collapse. Women's resilience was also relational. It extended beyond the self and into care for others. Nighttime vigilance often centered on children, elders, or the sick. Listening for changes in breathing. Adjusting blankets. Offering comfort in whispers. This attentiveness required emotional strength as much as physical stamina. There was also resilience in acceptance. Not resignation, but a clear-eyed understanding of limits. Women knew what could not be changed: the cold, the darkness, the lack of privacy. Rather than fighting these realities, they adapted to them. They found ways to function within constraint, which is a form of strength often overlooked. The night did not offer escape, but it did offer continuity. Its routines connected one day to the next, providing structure in a world shaped by uncertainty. Seasons change. Circumstances shifted. But the basic rhythm of night remained familiar. This familiarity offered a quiet form of stability. Faith, tradition, and shared knowledge reinforced this resilience. Practices were passed down not as theories, but as lived experience. How to bank a fire. How to move quietly in the dark. How to rest lightly but remain aware. These skills were refined across generations, forming a collective wisdom. Importantly, this resilience did not mean the absence of struggle. Fatigue was real. Frustration existed. There were nights when the weight felt heavier than usual. But endurance does not require ease. It requires persistence. And persistence was embedded in daily life. Modern perspectives often frame rest as a right or a reward. In the 1700s, rest was conditional. It depended on circumstances aligning just enough to allow it. Women learned not to expect ideal conditions. Instead, they took what was available and made it sufficient. This ability to find sufficiency in imperfection is a powerful lesson. It reveals a mindset shaped by necessity but capable of depth. Contentment was not constant, but purpose was. The work mattered, even if it went unseen. When we consider the nightly routines in their entirety, a pattern emerges. Each task, on its own, seems small. Undressing. Checking doors. Listening in the dark. But together, they form a cycle that required remarkable consistency. Strength was cumulative, built through repetition rather than intensity. This reframes how we understand historical endurance. It was not about extraordinary moments, but about ordinary ones sustained over time. The true test was not a single night, but thousands of them. Women carried this resilience into every aspect of life. It shaped how they approached hardship, loss, and change. It taught them to endure without constant reassurance, to act without certainty of reward. The night, then, becomes more than a setting. It becomes a teacher. It trained awareness. It demanded patience. It reinforced responsibility. And it revealed character. As modern viewers, we often look back searching for dramatic contrasts. But the real contrast lies in what we take for granted today. Light at the touch of a switch. Privacy as an expectation. Rest as a goal. These comforts highlight the depth of endurance required in the past. Understanding this does not require romanticizing hardship. It requires acknowledging it honestly. Recognizing that resilience developed because it had to, not because it was chosen freely. The women of the 1700s did not define themselves as resilient. They defined themselves by what needed to be done. Strength was not an identity. It was a function. And yet, when we observe their nights closely, resilience is unmistakable. It lives in their routines. in their adaptability, in their ability to begin again, each morning, carrying the weight of the night behind them. As this journey comes to a close, what remains is a deeper appreciation for the unseen labor of the past. The quiet strength that did not seek recognition, but sustained lives and families nonetheless. The night, with all its challenges, was survived. Again and again. And in that survival, a legacy of endurance was formed, one that continues to echo forward, even if history rarely pauses to name it. Thank you for staying with this story. In understanding the nights of the past, we gain a clearer view of the resilience that shaped everyday life, and a renewed respect for those who carried it quietly through the dark.